This is Anthony Morganti. Welcome to my podcast, For the Joy of Photography. Welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. It is Wednesday, January 30th, 2019. And if you live in the Midwest to Eastern United States, or in Canada, pretty much anywhere from Manitoba to Quebec, I hope you're safe. We're experiencing an Arctic blast of cold air. And here in Buffalo, New York, where it very rarely gets down to single digits, it's currently about 5 degrees outside. And from what I understand, in a couple hours, it's going to go below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's very unusual for Buffalo. So here in Buffalo, just about everything is closed. All the schools are closed. All the court buildings are closed. Government buildings, city hall's closed. So everyone, I hope, is home safe and staying warm with their family. And maybe you could take some macro shots of your around your house, or take some pictures of your kids or your pets to stay busy. Because I know if you're like me, probably get a little antsy staying locked up in the house. But anyway, thank you for tuning into the podcast. What we're going to be talking about today is what has hit the news recently. The president of Canon, his name is Fujio Mitarai. Sorry for the pronunciation. I kind of added a little bit of an Italian accent to that. Anyway, Fujio Mitarai recently did an interview with a Japanese website called Nikon. And he has kind of a grim outlook for the camera business. And all the photography news sites covered this. I'm going to quote directly from DIYphotography.net. And in the show notes, I'll have links to that. And I'll also have links to the article on F-Stoppers, who covered it, and Petapixel, who covered it. But I'm sure if you Google it, you'll see that dozens of different websites have talked about what Mitarai has talked about. And the title of the DIYphotography.net article is Canon sees a grim future for the camera business, expects digital camera market to shrink by half within 2 years. And I'm just going to read part of it. In a recent interview, Canon's president, Fujio Mitarai, expressed not so optimistic predictions for the future of the camera business. He admitted that Canon sales have declined by around 10% in the past couple of years, and he believes that it will get even worse. According to Mitarai, the digital cameras market could shrink by as much as 50% within the next 2 years. They have a direct quote here. I'm going to read it to you exactly what he said. It was translated by Google, and part of it doesn't really make much sense. But I'm going to read it to you nonetheless. He says, in our company, cameras have declined at around 10% a year by sales volume. In the past few years, combined with single lens reflex and mirrorless, the world market for interchangeable lens cameras is around 10 million. Now, this is where Google Translate gets a little unusual. But decrease the mirrorless product is growing, but it is a replacement with a single lens reflex. It is not adding to the market as a whole. Okay, so I think what that last part, what he meant was, or what he said was, that mirrorless is growing, but it's not really increasing the entire market. The entire market is still contracting and going down. Mirrorless is just eating into the sales of DSLRs, and still not at a rate that is making the market grow. So he has a grim outlook because the market is shrinking, and I think that's pretty well known. And the market is shrinking because partly, and I'm going to talk about some other reasons, and he mentions it here, mobile phones. Everyone has a mobile phone, and now the cameras in mobile phones are really good. They take great pictures. Those of you who follow me on Instagram might have saw a picture I posted when I was in Hilton Head Island this past summer. I have this picture that I took on the beach that I did with my iPhone 7, and it looks perfect. It looks every bit as good as a DSLR. And my iPhone 7 isn't even the latest iPhone, right? So Yes, mobile phones have come a long way. They've really eaten into the sales of digital cameras. But first of all, let's talk about Canon as a company. Um, Mitarai, as the president of Canon, he has an obligation to his shareholders to uh, maximize their share value. And how does he do that? Well, he has to be profitable. And Canon doesn't just do cameras. They're really a multifaceted technology company. They do a lot of different things, from medical to industrial to different, I know, go on and on. They do all different types of things, not just their camera department, let's say. So he has to maximize shareholder value by showing as much profit as possible. I mean, he's not going to throw money or resources at the digital photography part of his business if that is contracting globally. He's going to put his money into the parts of his business that show growth. So, yes, you could understand where he's coming from. He's not going to invest in the digital market or digital cameras as much. Didn't say he's abandoning it. Okay, so I don't want to give that impression. It's just he sees it shrinking and they're not going to be investing as much in their digital cameras. They're going to be going more towards other things that they see growth possibilities and growth opportunities. Now, Nikon, on the other hand, they're not into as much as Canon. They're not into as very different things. They seem to be a little more committed to cameras compared to Nikon, or compared to Canon at least. So, yes, I mean, he's right. But what he's failing to mention, or at least didn't come through in any of the translations I read about what he talked about, he's not talking about the other players in the market and what happened also. I mean, let's face it, Sony came in and totally disrupted Canon and Nikon's duopoly. I mean, for years, it was just Canon and Nikon, Canon and Nikon. And if you were interested in photography and you wanted to move up from your point and shoot camera into something better, you would move into an entry level, probably Canon and maybe Nikon. And I mean, what was that Canon Rebel? What was it? A T2, T3, T4, T5, T6? Where'd they stop? T7, T8? T7, I think maybe. Anyway, so you had all these entry-level Canons, entry-level Nikons, D3000, 3100, 3200, 3300. They came out every year with these incremental upgrades to the camera. But people were coming in and buying those things like crazy. And they made a ton of money on these cameras and then selling the lenses for them and stuff. So they really were cleaning up. Well, all of a sudden, Sony comes in and they start selling cameras that, technology-wise, were more advanced probably than those entry-level cameras. And they were selling them at very affordable prices. And they really came in and disrupted the market. Now, yes, then mobile phones were starting to get better and better and better. So people weren't buying those entry-level cameras anymore. They were just using their mobile phone. Well, Nikon seemed to understand this a little bit more, I think, than Canon did, in my opinion. Because then Nikon started putting their money and research dollars more into making affordable full-frame cameras. So you saw like the D600, and that had some issues. And then they upgraded to the D610. Then they had the D750, which really had a lot of pro features in it. And a lot of wedding photographers, like, that became the wedding photography camera if you're a Nikon shooter, because it had so many features that really endeared itself to a wedding photographer. So Nikon seemed to be putting their research and development dollars more into affordable full-frame cameras. And that they kind of weren't doing quite as much with the entry-level cameras. So yes, the market's shrinking, but you have to know where to put your money, right? Well, what still Nikon and Canon didn't do is they still didn't embrace mirrorless properly. I mean, they came out with crappy mirrorless cameras that no one wanted, right? And then finally, this past year, the end of the year, the past few months, they both came out with some mirrorless offerings, and they're full frame. right? Because I think that's where the money's going to be going. People aren't going to spend a few $1,000s on a crop sensor camera when Sony, they could spend that few $1,000s on a full frame crop sensor camera, right? So full frame's where it is. And so Nikon came out with a couple different models, and Canon has a model, and they're committed to coming out with lenses. They have lens roadmaps. So yes, I mean, Canon isn't investing as much money into their camera market, but you got to remember they had a huge line. All those entry-level cameras, those mid-level cameras, then their full-frame cameras. And now they have one mirrorless camera, and they're coming out with lenses for it. Nikon, I think, is going a little more full bore. Again, they're not as big a company as Canon. They don't do as much. They're more committed, I think, to digital photography. So they have their full-frame cameras, full-frame mirrorless cameras, two of them, and they have a lens roadmap with a lot of different lenses. So you see that happening. So you see how things are shifting. The emphasis isn't on entry-level DSLRs anymore. It's more on full-frame cameras that are affordable. Now, with that said, there's other players in the market that this president of Canon never mentioned either. Fujifilm and Olympus cannot be discounted either. They came out with very affordable crop sensor cameras, micro four thirds, or just, crop sensor as far as Fujifilm is concerned, but very affordable with really cutting edge features and a large set of lenses, right? So they actually further kind of bid into the market. But why, let's ask ourselves for a minute, why did Olympus and Fujifilm, why did they succeed? Or why are they succeeding? Well, I think they recognize where photography, I mean, there's different subgenres of photography, right? There's portrait photography, there's wedding photography, there's lifestyle photography, there's street photography, there's travel photography. We could go on and on. I won't. But we have all these subgenres. Well, which ones are really growing at the fastest rate? It's street photography and it's travel photography. Now, who wants to take a full-frame DSLR out on the street doing documentary street photography? It's really difficult to do, right? I mean, I do it because I'm stupid, I guess. But most often, someone who's really starting to get into street photography, let's say with their cell phone, they want to upgrade to a camera. They're not going to go buy a D850, right? Nikon D850. They're going to probably purchase a mirrorless camera. And they could get a Sony. Sony's a good choice because then they could do a lot of other different things too. If they get a Sony full-frame camera, maybe they want to do weddings. They could do it. And maybe they want to do portraiture. Maybe they want to open a studio. They could do all that with Sony full-frame camera, right? Really very easily. On the other hand, if they're just really interested in street photography or travel photography, Fujifilm and Olympus are awesome, right? They do great. They're smaller than the Sony even. They have great lenses. They have a good lens lineup, a lot to choose from. They have a lot of accessories. So that is taking a huge chunk out of the market as well. A market, again, that is shrinking, but the parts of the market that are growing, street photography and travel photography, Sony and Olympus are really aligned well to take advantage of the small parts of the market that are growing. Nikon and Canon are not, period, just aren't. So, and Sony has smartly positioned themselves kind of right in the middle. You could, like I said, get that Sony full frame camera, and you could you could open a studio. You could do product photography. You could do fashion photography. On the other hand, you could go out and do street documentary photography. And you can't discount a small camera is important for a lot of these things. If you go back in the history of photography around the 40s, when Leica came out with their smaller camera that took 35 millimeter roll film, that's when documentary photography started taking off, and you start seeing Life magazine and Look magazine and things. All these even National Geographic, although National Geographic was around a lot longer than that. But still, you saw that with these smaller cameras, these photographers could go into the remotest parts of the world or go to war zones and take images. So yeah, you need that smaller camera, right? So then Nikon, or I'm sorry, Fujifilm and Olympus and others. I mean, I don't mean to leave anyone out, but if you go by sales volume, I mean, it's the big two, and Sony, Nikon, or Fujifilm, and then Olympus, of course. So they have the highest sales. So, um, yeah, I mean, yeah, the market is shifting and it's contracting, but there's parts of the market that are growing that Canon and Nikon, especially Canon, weren't really poised, or maybe didn't really have the ambition to try to take advantage of or try to approach. And players like Fujifilm and Olympus did, and they're profiting from it, and they're doing very well from what I understand. So what does that mean for you? Well, if you're still using your mobile phone, as mentioned, they take great images. Well, I think what you have to ask yourself is, what type of photography are you really interested in, or what's your goals as a photographer to be? If you're really into documentary photography, street photography, and you think that's really all you want to do, then you'd probably look at a smaller camera, and even smaller than the Sony, other than some Sonys are, the newest Sony's pretty small, right? That's a crop sensor camera, pretty small. But maybe you could look into the Fujifilm or the Olympus camera for your needs. And remember, when you commit to a camera system, it's really a commitment, because then you're going to be buying lenses, and lenses aren't cheap, right? Several $100s to thousands of dollars for a lens. So when you commit, you got to make the right choice. So ask yourself what type of photography you're going to do. If you're going to be, you want to be, a fashion photographer, maybe look into a full frame system. Maybe even there's another segment that is growing that I don't think Nikon or Canon are going to approach, but Pentax and Fujifilm have, and that is more affordably priced and medium format cameras. That is a segment that is growing. You see, Pentax recently came out with a medium format camera that, I don't know, it's like just a few $1,000s, I think, and from what I understand, it's fantastic. And Fujifilm also. They had a model they came out with a couple of years ago. They just updated the model, I think, this month or two, within the last month or two. And that is a segment that is growing. So, you want to get into fashion photography. You want to be a editorial photographer. Maybe you'll be more interested in getting a medium format, and you got those very affordable choices there. If you have the extra money and you want to buy a Hasselblad or a Phase 1, you got extra 30 grand around, then by all means do that. But for maybe, 1/7 of that price, you could get a really, really good camera. So that's another, thing I'm talking about. You got to look at the little bubbles in the market, because there's always little parts of it that are growing. And I don't think Canon, from what, you interpret what this president's saying, I don't think they're interested in even trying to compete in these markets. Travel photography, I mentioned before. It's a growing market. People are going out. They're traveling more, first of all. That's travel has been going up for the last, I think, the last I read, the last like 22 years. It's been raised. Travel, people have been traveling year over year, every year, more so. So travel photography is one thing that is growing. People don't want to carry much more than their phone, so that's why you're seeing these smaller cameras being more used more for travel photography. I know when I travel, I take my Fujifilm X-T1 and a couple lenses, and I could fit it in a very small camera bag, compared to if I take my Nikon D850 and a couple 3 lenses, and that goes into a Pelican case when I travel. So recently, when I went to New York, was it? Yeah, I went to New York recently, and I took Nikon D850 and a Nikon 28 to 300 and a 24 to 70 and a 14 to 24, and I had them in a Pelican case, and it was just a pain in the neck. The time before that, when I went to New York, I took my Fujifilm X-T1. I forgot the focal length of the lens. It's something like 18 to 140, and kind of a super zoom lens like that. And then I took a 23 millimeter lens. and I put them in a small, very small camera bag. And, it was a lot easier lugging that around. So yeah, when you're doing travel photography, why take all that heavy stuff unless you're a pro and you need to take images that are spec'd specifically for a certain type of deal that you sign, that you need to have a large sensor to capture it. You could do that with Sony though now too. So my recommendations to you depend or decide what type of photographer you are, what you want to get into, and if you're like into a lot of different things and you want to do a lot of different things, I would say probably go with Sony right now. If you're really into street photography or travel photography, look at one of the smaller systems. Going to be a little more affordable than, let's say, a full frame camera would be. So decide, like I said, the market is shrinking. It's not going away totally, though. It's just shifting. You're going to see more technology come to the forefront, different things you'll be able to do. I don't think, at least over the next several years, you're going to see any weddings shot on smartphones by professionals. You're going to still see professional photographers using professional equipment for like a wedding. So I wouldn't get too worried about things like that. But, you got to recognize the market. And recognize, too, I think a lot of these websites, when they quoted this Fujio Mitarai from Canon, they didn't really take into context what he was saying and what he represents, who he works for, what his obligations are to his company, what he must do for his company. He's not just the president of the camera department. He's the president of everything. He's got to take care and worry about making sure the entire company is as profitable as possible. So that's what I think is being lost in a lot of these reports that we're reading on these photography blogs and websites about what he said. So that's my take on it, and that's what I think is happening. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I'd like to just thank everyone, though, for indulging me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for watching my podcast, For the Joy of Photography. Remember, stop by my website, onlinephotographytraining.com. There you'll find all my latest videos and articles to help you improve your photography. That's it for now. I'll talk to you guys soon.